Well, as we conclude our series of Luke 10, we're going to take 2 points this morning. We're first going to look at the big picture of the passage, and then secondly, we'll look at the clear trajectory of the parable. And in order for us to understand this big picture, I think we need to dive into the 2 questions that the lawyer asks, and then watch how Jesus responds to these 2 questions. The first one is, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And then a second question, a follow-up question in verse 28, who is my brother? His first question comes in verse 25. You can see it there. It says this, and behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? The passage tells us right away, we look at the motive of this question, the motive of the lawyer. The passage tells us that this lawyer was trying to put Jesus to the test by asking him this question. And so Jesus, being able to look into the man's heart and knowing his heart, kind of turns it back on him and just asks him a question in response. How do you read it? I mean, what's your perspective on what the law says? And so the lawyer answers as any other good Jew would answer that type of question by quoting what was commonly known as a summary statement to the entire law and prophets. So these 2 commandments that he quotes, what Jesus calls the greatest commandment, the first commandment, and the second commandment, that you shall love your neighbor as yourself, everyone would have known that that is a summary statement for the entire law. Jesus said it this way in Matthew 22. He says this to the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The lawyer asked him in this passage, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus said, you shall love your Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. He says, this is the great and first commandment. A second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And in verse 40 of chapter 22, he says, on these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. The big picture of this passage is to, number 1, highlight the impossibility of justifying oneself. The big picture of this passage, number 2, is to help every individual see his or her desperate and helpless position apart from Christ. The big picture of the passage, number 3, is to point every person to Christ, the world's only hope for our biggest problem, which is our sin and rebellion against our Creator. It's the big picture of this passage as we step back. This then leads to our second point. We understand the big picture. Now let's look at the trajectory of the parable. In other words, this parable is heading somewhere. It's leading us to an ultimate fulfillment. Really, in our passage today, that it's pointing to or heading us to the fact that Jesus is the true and better Samaritan, who didn't come to where we were by just crossing the street, but came to where we were by leaving heaven. He's the true and better Samaritan who didn't just give 2 denarii, but ultimately gave himself. He's the true and better Samaritan who bore the wrath, not just bandaged the wounds. Who didn't just pour on oil and wine, but instead pours on grace and mercy and more grace and more mercy. He's the true and better Samaritan who gave his life, not just lent out his donkey. He's the true and better Samaritan who pays our entire debt, not just a few days' wages. He's the one who saves us, not just from robbers and a few days of recovery, but from the power of sin and an eternity in hell.